Today's session, Mr. Campbell, Richard Campbell, is going to talk about the history of .NET. He will be talking for about an hour. Richard has been playing in computers since he was 10 years old. He has gone through many different positions, we'll say, and responsibilities, from developer, business owner, architect, designer. You probably know him most recently, recently as in from 2004 till now, on .NET Rocks with Carl Franklin. You've also probably seen him come around. He's been at Philly.net at least once that I remember, or maybe twice actually. Now I think about it, once for a .NET Rocks tour, and another time when we had a code camp at Penn State Abington. In fact, myself and Carl and another local Rich Ross went out for cheesesteaks. So he has quite a wealth of knowledge. He's been knows Bill Gates and many other people personally, so he has the knowledge for what the history of .NET is. I'm going to turn it over to him. Richard, this is all you.
Thanks, Tony. And let me get the share working there. I don't know Bill Gates personally, man. I've met him a few times. I've had lunch with him. I don't know that he could pick me out of a crowd. But I played mini golf with Steve Ballmer, if that counts for anything. There's my Twitter handle. That's probably the easiest way to reach me if you'd like to chat. And yeah, the podcast seemed to be the thing that most folks know. My friend Carl Franklin started .NET Rocks back in 2002, which is before the word podcast existed. And I've been involved since episode 100 as a co-host. And we published episode 1722 yesterday. I also do an IT podcast because I kind of live in both worlds. And that's been every Wednesday since April 11th, 2007. So the latest show came out this just past Wednesday at 758. And for a brief period, directly related to the history of .NET too, from 2011 to 2014, we made another show called The Tablet Show. And that's when tablets were new, and we weren't quite sure how they're all going to fit together. And it's also a pretty dark time for .NET. And so that was our contingency show, shall we say. But after a few years, when it was clear that .NET was going to continue to rock, we rolled that back into .NET Rocks. All right, let's jump back. If we're going to talk about the history of .NET, we've got to talk a little bit about the history of Microsoft. And that's the original Microsoft logo from 1975. If you've never seen it before, it's very disco. And that's, of course, when Bill leaves Harvard, working with Paul Allen, to program this machine, the Altair 8800, which was in New Mexico. And that's pretty early days, right? That's only 4K of RAM, like not a lot of capability for some of the first microcomputers ever. There doesn't seem to be any copies of the original version of BASIC that Microsoft made, that Bill and Paul made. But this version is actually in the, is an 8K BASIC from 1978. This is sort of the second version of BASIC. And that's really what Microsoft started out making, right? That they were about building software, and in fact, selling software, which is an unusual concept. And I'm going to do another talk later on today about when open source came to Microsoft, and that's when I talk a lot more about the software side of the business. But in the beginning, Microsoft was a development tools company. That's what they did first and foremost. Then we move up a logo. This is the 1980s logo. So now Microsoft's relocated to Redmond, and they get a new business opportunity. IBM comes a-calling, and they want an operating system. There's a great long story about why that existed, that IBM became this dominant computer company that ultimately ran afoul of the Department of Justice and had a consent decree that mandated them to go to and outsource non-critical technologies. And they considered their microcomputers operating system to be non-critical. The original operating system for the IBM PC was CP/M. MS-DOS wasn't all that important, especially in the early days. But that story is how Microsoft really gets into the operating system business. And so the logo gets modernized again in the 1990s with the advent of Windows and this sort of hegemony that we know Microsoft of, if you're sort of into that history, which now more than 20 years ago. I mean, I think it's interesting, certainly something I was thinking about, from that paper tape to terabyte SSDs that you can stick up your nose, 40 years? I mean, it's astonishing in the lifetime of a person. what's happened in computing. But by the late 90s, Microsoft makes a host of different development tools, along with many, many other products. And of course, Windows at the center of everything. And in an effort to try and organize things, they came up with this product called Visual Studio. And the first version was the 97 edition, developed in 1996. Now, you got to think about this era in the middle 90s. So they've modernized Windows, going from the 16-bit to the 32-bit version of Windows 95. Like, that's already well underway. The internet has now been recognized as the way forward, and Bill writes this great letter they now call the Internet Tidal Wave letter internally in May of 1995. And so Microsoft made a bunch of different products that were related to development, and you can see them here on that picture of Visual Studio 97. There's Visual Basic, originally released in 91, now at version 5. Fox Pro, which they acquired, they also numbered it 5. J++, Microsoft made a great version of Java at that time, and their second edition was called 1.1. Visual InterDev. Poor Visual InterDev. That's Microsoft's first real attempt, that and Front Page, to get into internet development, and it had some problems. Visual SourceSafe, one of the first GUI-based source control systems, and we'll talk a bit about its origins earlier on, and so forth. That's Visual Studio 97, and it's important to remember that Microsoft was making a version of Java, and a very successful version of Java, maybe a little too successful version of Java, because of course, with the dominance of Windows on the desktop at that time in the 90s, right? This is when we're coming out of Windows 95 and into Windows 98 and NT4. The optimization of Java towards operating as effectively with Windows, primarily working with COM objects, meant that pretty quickly Microsoft was going to run afoul of the agreement they had with some microsystems that owned Java at the time. It was never a real good relationship, but it turned into a battle pretty quickly. The second edition of Visual Studio was Visual Studio 6, because numbers are hard. So they went from 97 to 6, and in 6, everything is numbered 6. So Visual Basic 6, C++ 6, Fox Pro 6, J++ 6, which is interesting because they just done 1 and 1.1, and now they went to 6. And that's the third version of J++, because again, numbers are hard, but it's also the last version of J++, because that's the point at which Sun comes down with a cease and desist because of Microsoft's customizations on Java, nominally being in violation. And so we're hitting an interesting breaking point. And I would also point out, if you've not spent any time with this early version of Visual Studio, because after this, when we start getting the .NET editions, it's much more unified. This idea of a unified IDE was a promise, not a truth. The IDE at this time in Visual Studio, both 97 and 6 editions, C++, VB, and Fox all had their own IDEs in the box. So really, you're just bundling products. The unified IDE was only for InterDev and Java, J++. But then, of course, J++ was going away. Now, we got to talk a little bit about the political landscape of Microsoft at the time. And I refer to this happy picture from July of 1998 of Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer. And don't they look happy? And that's because the hammer is about to come down and they don't know yet. I mean, Microsoft had been wildly successful. It's hard to get your head around how big they were. But I found a couple of Time magazine covers that I think sort of bring that idea forward. This is a cover from June of 1995, right at the time of hyping up for Windows 95, which again was that 16-bit to 32-bit breakthrough. And they were calling Bill the master of the universe. Microsoft's original mantra had been a PC on every office desk, right? That everyone would have a PC. And even by that point, they'd largely achieved their goal. They'd made the PC a mainstream device for business, that everybody would have one. The home was still coming, but business certainly had gotten there. Even in 95, even at the time of that cover, they were having issues with the Federal Trade Commission, the United States, around the bundling of Office and Windows. Microsoft has basically said, hey, there's one price for Windows if you include Office, which costs an additional amount. But you don't include Office, then it costs more. And they also would price it where you don't actually buy licenses per se. If you're a PC seller, every PC you sell, regardless of what you put on it, you pay us a fee. And so that way you would always put Windows on it. It would discourage any other operating system. And the FTC argued about that, and they changed those policies. But there's an inflection moment, and that inflection moment is in August of 1998. If you want to watch this, it is on YouTube. You can find this. This is when Bill is deposed by the U.S. Senate about anti-competitive practices in the computing industry. And it's interesting right now, we talk about what's going on with Facebook and Google and Apple. I'm pretty sure all of those folks have watched these videos as an example of what not to do when talking to senators, because they did not go well. And at that point forward, the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission went after Microsoft pretty hard, to the point where they declared ultimately by 1999 that Microsoft was a pernicious monopoly that needed to be broken up. And the cover of Time in November of 99 is busting Bill. And so Microsoft was actually ordered to split into two companies, a company that made the operating system and a company for everything else. And this is a picture of our two heroes from January of 2000. This is the announcement where Bill is stepping down as CEO and Steve is taking over. Now, this was a process that was already ongoing at the time, that Bill was handing more and more work to Steve to be CEO, but it's pretty apparent that the DOJ issue accelerated that. And so the declarations in November of 1999, Steve takes over in January 2000, and mission one for Steve is to keep the company together. And he will ultimately succeed, but it'll take him almost 2 years. He won't get that consent decree agreed to by the Department of Justice to keep Microsoft together till November of 2001. So really quite a long time. And, it's hard to imagine what Microsoft would have been like if Steve had not succeeded in that effort. But he pulled it off. And I talk about this primarily for you to understand the world that .NET was being born into. So we saw Studio 6 by 1998 with J++ going away and this array of different development tools. And then it was kind of quiet. We were kind of used to Microsoft putting out a new product every year so that they'd have more to sell us, right? We'd keep renewing our licenses. But now you've been a few years. They've been distracted. It was kind of a quiet time in development. We were all happy, but they were exploring. And there were some certain issues that they're trying to solve, right, during that time. And it's important to understand that .NET is really sort of an emergent tool. And I'm going to break it into 3 areas. And I'm going to put a face on each of those areas. But I want you to understand, behind each one of those leaders was dozens, even hundreds of remarkable engineers. So first problem addressed, and the face I'm going to put on that problem is Brian Harry. Now, Brian Harry is from North Carolina. He's a NC State grad, and he was brought into Microsoft in an acquisition. He and his brother had formed a company in North Carolina, and they made a source control system, and they put a Windows GUI on it very early on. And Microsoft acquired that entire company and Brian and his brother, and they moved them all to Redmond. That became Visual SourceSafe. So Visual SourceSafe came from Brian Harry, ultimately. And Brian took on what would become the runtime, or the CLR project. Now, this is a project that existed independent of the idea of .NET. .NET is an emergent thing. The issue they were trying to address was the fact that they had multiple development tools, FoxPro, C++, VB, and each of them accessed features in Windows differently. They all had their own runtimes, right? I mean, to this day, Windows still ships with the VB runtime from VB6. And so that was challenging for Windows in the sense that essentially each time Windows would make new features, each programming team essentially had to decide how they were going to surface those features in their dev tools. And there's a certain amount of lag and a certain amount of decision making. It makes for let's call it an asymmetrical experience. And so the idea of a common runtime across all those tools was an interesting idea, independently of what you were going to build on top of it, per se. Also, there was diversification happening in the compute side. Even in 2000, the Itanium was under development. The NT at that time, although it would quickly end, actually ran on 4 different platforms, on MIPS, on PowerPC, as well as on Intel. There was another one, Alpha, right? Now, they eventually all go Intel, but at that time, there was, how do we have a runtime that covers all of those different processors so the developers can write once, run on all of those platforms? Next element of .NET, Anders Hallsberg. Now, Anders was the Borland guy, right? And he had originally developed Turbo Basic and Turbo Pascal that eventually evolved into Delphi, and then he got hired into Microsoft. And he got hired into Microsoft to build tooling for Java. And then he was working on J++ nonstop. And then when J++ had to go away, he needed a job. He needed something to do. And Microsoft also needed an object-oriented language platform. That was important. And so he actually presented an idea for a C object-oriented language, or COOL. COOL, cool. And if you were around in the early days of .NET, you saw that cool tag every so often for C object-oriented language. That was Anders's project. And so largely that emerged to eventually be called C#. He also built a product called J#. And J# was a bridge from J++, from the Microsoft version of Java, to C#, or more importantly, to its runtime. A key part of the agreement between Sun and Microsoft in ending the relationship with Java is that they would not use the Java runtime at all. At that time, the JVM only ran Java. I mean, today it's crazy because we have Clojure and a dozen other languages that run against the Java runtime. But at that time, it was only Java, and they were pretty adamant about that. And so the fact that there was a runtime being developed inside of Microsoft was super useful. And when they were talking about how an object-oriented and memory-managed programming language would exist. So those two things will start to come together, although the path is never that straight. And the last face I want to throw up there, and you'll probably recognize this guy, Mr. Guthrie, also from North Carolina, Duke University. And the two universities have quite a rivalry. Younger, he had interned at Microsoft. It was kind of a rock star right from the very beginning. And folks, he had a pick of jobs. He could work anywhere at all. And in my interviews with Scott around this particular subject, he brought up the fact that it was JLR. He was thinking about going to Windows. He was going to go join the Windows team. It seemed like the coolest team at Microsoft. And JLR convinced him. He says, listen, Windows is done. Windows is made. We need new things made. You should be working on something new, like focus on the web. And this is in the late 90s. And so Scott actually joined a team called the NT Option Pack team, which is a terrible name. But what was in the NT Option Pack was IIS, Internet Information Server, and active server pages. And so very early on, Scott's job was, how do we modernize active server pages? And there's sort of an apocryphal story. He joined Microsoft in '97, just as Studio 6 was in development. And Studio 6 shipped in November of '97. And it's very normal in those old days of 12 to 18-month dev cycles that when the product finally releases, everybody takes a couple of weeks off. It's hard to get to the ship date. But in this case, it fell in December. And so if you're taking a couple of weeks off after a ship date, then you run into Christmas. So pretty much everybody related to Studio 6 took December off, but not our young Mr. Guthrie. He did not want to take time off, and instead what he did was he worked on prototyping what the next version of active server pages could look like. And he knew it wanted it to be object-oriented all the way down, and that it would live on top of IIS. And so he drafted this prototype over that month, working largely by himself, of what he called ASP+. And the scripting language, the language that you and I would program in, was Java. That's what the initial implementation looked like. And it wouldn't change. When he showed off the prototype in January of 98, when everybody was back to work, they said, hey, we really love the direction you're going in. Can't use Java. And they kind of went back to the drawing board and rebuilt it and went through a few more iterations before we would emerge as .NET. All right, I've set a landscape now. These three pillars: the runtime, the language platform, which included the base class libraries, and the web. The web development was an area being explored on its own. And these three things would eventually come together to be this product we know and love called .NET. So fast forward to July of 2000 in the PDC. And by the way, this is a copy of the original graphic of PDC, the Professional Developers Conference in Orlando. It's not the actual one, because the actual one in 2000 was about a 320 by 200 graphic. I actually paid someone to remake this in a 1080p size, so that's why it looks so nice. The real ones did not look nice. And this is where Steve Ballmer gets on stage to announce .NET. It kind of blindsides folks. They didn't know this was coming. But remember, it's July of 2000, so Steve's only taken over as CEO as of January. And he's right in the midst of negotiations with the Department of Justice for that consent decree he'll get 18 months later. And so when he talks about .NET, he talks about it in the context of a new platform based on internet standards. And part of that includes that they're going to publish the specifications for what would be known as C# as an ECMA specification. And almost also the Common Language Infrastructure, the CLI, will be another ECMA specification. And this is part of a gesture to show Microsoft being more open. I mean, ultimately, that's what that consent decree will have in it, that if you're a developer working against Windows, and you can demonstrate a need to access the low-level parts of Windows that you don't know how to do it correctly, then Microsoft will make that source code available to you in some degree. And that had been one of the arguments they made to the Department of Justice, is that Microsoft was building code inside of the operating system that would break other software. And if you one of the folks that spoke at that time was the Real Networks folks that said, why is the Real player always not work as well as the Windows Media player? We think Microsoft is sabotaging us. It wasn't true. They just weren't implementing against the libraries particularly well, but having access to the low levels of the libraries helped them write better versions. That's ultimately what will come from that consent decree. But in the first time that we heard about .NET out in the world was at this PDC, and it came with these, what was kind of surprising, sort of open specification announcements. Now, in that same time frame, we get Windows 2000. And why is Windows 2000 important? Because this is where the two lines, the NT line and the 9X line, 98, 98 SCE, and let's not talk about ME, they come together with NT into one. And so 2000 was kind of a plumbing version of Windows, but it was also a real shakeout. This is when the Windows team stopped supporting Alpha, MIPS, and PowerPC. It became Intel only. This is also the first version of Windows where TCP/IP is the default network stack. Up until now, it had been NetBEUI. And so it's interesting to just think in terms of, it's only been the past 20 years that this kind of model really became a thing, that Intel and processors and TCP/IP as networking. This is also when the first Pentium 4s come along. We get to a gigahertz of processing power. Fun times, but that's the beginning of all of that. Another thing that happened right in that same time frame is this young man, a fellow by the name of Miguel Diaz, who had looked through the specifications that Microsoft had published around C#. He really liked the language. He thought it was impressive. And he was a Linux guy through and through. And his big push, the product he worked the longest on, was called GNOME, and it was a GUI for Linux. But he also, looking at the ECMA specifications, thought, I really want to make an implementation of C# that runs on Linux platform. He does a clean room implementation that we will know as the Mono project, and Mono being Spanish for monkey. So Miguel's 29 years old. It's July of 2001. He announces at an O'Reilly conference that he's going to work on this. It makes everybody upset. And poor Miguel. The Microsoft people were always vaguely uncomfortable. Remember that in that same time span, in fact, in that very same year, or maybe it was in 2000, is when Steve said Linux is a cancer. And here was this nice guy who was trying to build a Linux version of .NET. He wasn't breaking any laws. The specification had been published, although they never expected anyone to use it. The Linux community is appalled. Why would Miguel build something that works with Microsoft technology? So he ended up in a really interesting place. All open source, before open source was sexy. The first version of Mono will ship in June of 2004. And so in 2001, we have the next PDC, this time in Los Angeles. And this is important for a bunch of reasons. We get the release candidates of .NET and Visual Studio.NET. We also get Windows XP. And this is also around the same time that Microsoft will get that consent decree. So at that point, that's sort of settled. So the PDC 2001 was quite a celebration. And XP, well, our fond memories of XP are really after Service Pack 2. This is before Service Pack 2. Like, this is before USB is supported. It's also at the time when the success of Windows, the dominance of Windows, means that every bad guy hacks at Windows. So if you think back to 2001, this is where you get the Anna Kournikova virus and the Code Red Worm and Code Red Worm 2 and Nimda. It's just a non-stop series of security attacks and worms and so forth. I mean, it was a kind of friendlier kind of hacking. They were just propagators. They really didn't have payloads. But this is when Bill Gates, who's acting as chief architect, not CEO anymore, puts out the Trustworthy Computing Letter. Much like his Internet Tidal Wave letter of 1995, in 2002, puts out the Trustworthy Computing Letter. And essentially what Bill was able to do was to tell the entire organization, tens of thousands of people, stop what you're doing and focus on security. Build security features. Now, this impacts XP in a very important way. So XP is already shipped at this point. And as is normal when shipping a big product like an operating system, there's a bunch of stuff that doesn't make it into the initial build or needs some fixing. It's going to be delayed, and there's patches and stuff you make it. So Service Pack 1 is already largely declared by the time XP ships. They already have a pretty good plan on what Service Pack 1 is going to look like. But to deal with the security side of things, they actually kick into Service Pack 2. And this is a big impact on Windows, because in order to do significant security fixes inside of Windows, which is arguably the most important thing they needed to secure, it meant taking very senior people from the team and having them focused on Service Pack 2 for quite a while. So the Windows team gets a bit schismed while they're dealing with this. And that'll have some impacts going forward. So February of 2002 is when we get our first version of .NET. So this is the 1.0 of C#. This is J#, the path forward for J++. Andrew's finding a way to help our developers move on. FoxPro is not in the box. They go off and get shipped independently. Included as part of this release is a thing called Rotor in March of 2002. And this is part of that consent decree was that this new development environment, there'd be what they called a shared source implementation of the CLR. So it was really an academic research license, and you had to sign for the license. It was free, but you had to have academic credentials to have access to it. And it allowed you to look at .NET, but not compile it. And it didn't have any of the Windows-related stuff. So, stuff like WinForms, things like that, that wasn't in there. It's just the underlying language-based class libraries, things like that. It was Stephen Wally that was leading that particular thing. In the release of .NET in 2002, they were differentiating themselves from Java. Java's catchphrase at that time was any platform, one language. And Microsoft's approach was 22 languages, one platform. So the original version of .NET, they shipped with 22 languages. The question is, could you name 22 languages? And it took me a while to actually find all the languages that were in the box when it shipped in 2002, but there they are. Now, the origins of some of these languages are really interesting. I mean, that time, of course, C# was called C#.NET, and so was VB.NET, and so forth. Those ones you'll probably recognize. COBOL, from the very beginning, and to this day, still in the store, a version of COBOL and a version of Fortran. So several of these languages were built by Microsoft. A bunch of them were built by industry folks. So the original versions of COBOL.NET actually built by the Fujitsu Corporation. IBM supports Fortran.NET, again, to this day. But many of the other languages you see on this list were built by academics. So Microsoft in the development of .NET went out into the academic community, into the large computing science programs, and encouraged professors to put together teams to build implementations of languages against .NET. Now this is odd in the sense that a lot of these languages never got past version 1 in .NET. They were built, they were shipped as part of the product, and then that was kind of the end of them from there. But the seeds of this will show up again in that academic way of using .NET in the runtime model as basically having access to an editor and things for experimenting with other languages. It's where F# ultimately comes from. That's later in the story. Let's keep moving on. With 1.1, the second version, really that cleanup version. That's actually C# 1.2, and they're trying to get their feet on themselves, get the product robust enough and ready to really be an enterprise development tool. They wouldn't get there with 1.1 quite yet. This is also the point where Brian Harry, who had been leading the CLR initiative, leaves. He actually was planning on leaving Microsoft, although he ultimately doesn't do that. He goes off to work on what will eventually become Team Foundation Server, because he's got a thing for source control, who knows. And a young man by the name of Jason Zander will take over the CLR team going forward. In 2003, we get the next PDC, and the focus is not on .NET. So if you think about PDC in 2000 and 2001, .NET was a big driver as well as a new version of Windows. But in 2003 is when they really start talking about what's the version of Windows that comes after XP. Now, XP had been an incredibly dominant version of Windows, and so Microsoft, up until then, had been putting out versions of Windows from 95 to 2001. I mean, almost every year. 95, 98, 98 SE, ME, NT351, NT4, 2000, XP. Now it's been a couple of years. And they present this idea, and they do it very publicly. One would argue too publicly. But again, you remember, this is in the context of the consent decree. Microsoft's trying to be the kinder, gentler tech giant. They're trying to be more visible to the world. And so they talk about Longhorn. So the code name for XP was Whistler, which is Ski Mountain, not far from where I am, in British Columbia, just north of Seattle and Redmond. Microsoft folks come up here all the time. It was always a thing, including the senior leadership. And the next ski mountain beside Whistler is a mountain called Blackcomb. And the original code name for Windows Next after XP was actually Blackcomb. And that is when, Bill's now chief architect, and they're really trying to explore, what would you do if you could do anything you wanted with an operating system? We're on top of the world. We can do anything we want. And so they went with this massive object-oriented design that ultimately got scaled back. It was a bit too much. And so if you ever get up to Whistler Village, where the Whistler and Blackcomb mountains are, in between the two mountains is in a very large bar called the Longhorn Bar. And so Windows Longhorn was that intermediary stage between Whistler and Blackcomb. And it had the 4 pillars, and the 4 pillars were Avalon, Arrow, Indigo, and WinFS. And so Avalon was a new visual rendering system. Windows had been schismed for some time in the way that it rendered its vision systems. It had DirectX to draw for gaming systems, and otherwise it had bit blending, essentially. It had the GDI for drawing on the screen. And this was to unify those two things, a standard way to draw on the screen. That was Avalon. Arrow was the new graphical interface with transparency and a new look and style and a different implementation so that all software could look at that same style. Indigo was a communication layer, whether it was within a process, between processes, between machines, across the internet, all transportation and messaging the same. And WinFS being this object-oriented file system out of the Blackcomb project. These were the 4 pillars, and they promised the world, and it wouldn't go well. August of 2004, XP SP2 finally ships. And one could argue it probably should have been called XP version 2, because it was an all-new, it was a breaking change version of the operating system. It was a big deal. One of the reasons they made it the service pack was so that everybody would install it, because it was the security fixes of Windows, and they wanted everyone to install it. They wanted to give it away. Today we don't think much about that, but at that time, a new version of Windows was something you had to pay for, and you had to contemplate whether you wanted to buy it or not. And if they had sold it as a new version of Windows, it would have probably fixed a lot of problems, but they didn't. But coming out of that reshuffling of the teams as the service pack finishes, as this big press of security ends, they look at the situation of how Windows is being developed and they have to revise it. They change everything. Part of what was happening inside of that operating system was that they wanted to incorporate .NET at a very low level. And that was having some challenges because the programming models were extremely different. And Windows teams, those are all C++ programmers. And for the most part, the .NET developers at that time, also C++ programmers, but architecturally, very, very different. In 2005, we get Studio 2005 and .NET 2. And one would argue this was the great version. Like, as often happens with Microsoft technology, the third version, although it was number 2, because numbers are hard, is really the breakthrough one. There's a few things that made .NET 2 so robust. And one of the most critical things in my mind, and certainly in my research of this problem, is SQL Server 2005. So the SQL Server team had approached the .NET team, and they had a need. They had customers that wanted to do advanced computational work against data sets. And so rather than having to query that data set out of the database to do the processing on it, they wanted to do it within the database. Now, TransSQL is a great version of SQL, but it's not up for real complex computation. They wanted a more sophisticated language. And so they pressed on the .NET team to say, could you put .NET into SQL Server? At that time, Jason Zander was leading the CLR team, and he talks about the fact that he didn't think it was that good of an idea. And one would argue it's still not that good of an idea. I mean, 15 years on, it really, there's a reason why .NET is off by default. Although it's interesting that today there's now a Java runtime inside of SQL Server and in Oracle. But the big thing they saw was that the tooling around understanding the performance of SQL Server and debugging SQL Server was incredibly robust. And so by implementing .NET inside of SQL Server, they were able to analyze problems they were having in .NET that they were never able to figure out in Windows. And the way Jason described it to me is that in a period of just 6 months or so, they found 30 real low-level bugs they'd never been able to nail down. And fixing those things is one of the key reasons that the 2 version was so robust that it really hit that enterprise class where you could run a .NET DLL in a server and not be the reason that server ever has to reboot. That it will actually not leak memory, that it'll be reliable. That's one of the reasons this was such a critical version of .NET and really put it on the stage as this reliable, stable server-based platform. But tides are changing too. One would argue this is when Microsoft has now delivered on the original promise of .NET, but the needs are different. The web is evolving. And in 2006, Microsoft creates a new conference called Mix. And Mix is really their press towards the web. How do we make the web work in the Microsoft world? This is another one of those graphics I had to reinvent because the original Mix graphic was too small for modern screens. I should mention Internet Explorer because back in XP days in 2001 is when IE6 shipped. And IE6 had now been around for 5 years. It's at Mix where IE7 is announced. It's released in October of 2006. So there was a long period there. It's one of the reasons that IE6 gets the gravity that it had since it was around for so very long. And in that same time period, we get Vista. Now, from a .NET perspective, what Vista really meant was their dismantling of those pillars of Avalon, Indigo, WinFS, and so forth, is that they actually pressed them into .NET. So while .NET 2 was sort of that triumph in 2005, really manifest the whole thing, .NET 3 is actually this version to catch everything coming out of the Vista fallout. So it's still the CLR 2.0, but now we have the .NET framework running on XP that includes Avalon and Indigo, which will be renamed to Windows Presentation Foundation and Windows Communication Foundation, also Workflow and Card Space. It's also interesting to note that this is the point at which we start going really multi-core, where CPU speeds stop going up, but the number of cores start increasing. And it takes a while for software to realign to that particular problem. And in 2007, this darn phone shows up. Now, it's not a great phone at this time, but it is kind of the harbinger, it's kind of the end of smartphones From the iPhone onward, everything ends up being just a slab of black glass, even though the original one was kind of silver. I mean, before the iPhone, phones were cool. You know, some of them had keyboards and little roller balls and slide outs and antennas and things. But after the iPhone, everything's a slab of black glass. Dull, 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 dull. However, that won't impact .NET just yet. Part of that mixed conversation was that there would be a special version of WPF for WPF Everywhere, or WPF-E. And as ugly as the code name, as the product names were for Windows Presentation Foundation and so forth, after having great code names like Avalon and Indigo, they go the other way. When we interviewed Brad Abrams for the launch, he said, you know, we called it Windows Presentation Foundation Everywhere because if you have a bad code name, you get a great product name. Announced it mixed. The CTP ships at the end of 2006. Now, Scott Guthrie was largely driving this, and Scott had come to appreciate that the cadence of 12 to 18 months to release new versions of operating systems and programming tools was not rapid enough, that he wanted to iterate quickly on Silverlight. And so he started shipping Silverlight out of band. So rather than making it part of Studio, you could download it on the internet. How interesting. And so he actually puts out a lot of different versions very quickly. So the CTP, the Community Technical Preview, is in December of 2006. The original version didn't include C# at all, right? You actually coded in JavaScript. And it did have a subset of XAML, which was sort of its claim to fame, WPF-E. It was really about media playback. Their original versions worked closely with IIS for variable bandwidth, so that you would have multiple encodings of videos based on what bandwidth availability, and they could skip up and down. That was very innovative at the time. But over the next less than a year, they would have 4 major updates to Silverlight. So very rapid fire. By this point, ASP.NET Web Forms, which was really an innovative tool at the time, really helping those who were used to working in WinForms start to develop on the web without having to think too much about the new model, is getting long enough in the tooth. And there are other tools out there like Ruby on Rails that introduce the idea that we need something new, and that's becomes .NET MVC. And I'm going to do this talk later today about when open source came to Microsoft, and I'll talk a lot about the role that MVC played in that. It's also when Scott hires his Ninja Army, Scott Hanselman, Phil Hack, Rob Connery. There's some other great guys that get involved at that time, all open source folks. And it's kind of an apocryphal story about them announcing MVC at a conference in Austin. And I'll again drill more into that later on today. But this is the beginning of them approaching web development very differently. Studio 2008, out in November of 2007. This is the .NET Framework 3.5. So that's more of the next version of .NET they intended to make, not dealing with the Vista fallout. This is when we get Link, which, you know, we can have a long conversation about how great Link was or isn't, or how you enjoy it. This is when Team System first appears. That's Brian Harry's project after the CLR, when he went back to North Carolina and started running a new team. This is when that surfaces into the box. Really, at that point, a competitor for Rational Roads. And so we have the PDC 2008. This is now Ray Ozzie's show. He's the chief architect. Bill is on his way out to focus on the foundation, curing malaria and a bunch of other distractions. Silverlight is front and center in 2008 with Silverlight 2, working on this is when .NET comes to Silverlight. We get MVVM, C#, all those fun things. Our friend Miguel Diaz talks about Moonlight, which is actually supported by Microsoft. Microsoft helped the Mono project build a version of Silverlight for Linux. But this is also where Ray talks about the cloud for the first time in 2008, and he calls it Windows Azure. And this idea that Microsoft had all these huge web products, all with their own individual hardware and architectures and so forth, and they wanted to unify all of this. And in a lot of ways, he described serverless right from the very beginning. Not that anybody wanted it, but that's where they were headed. The cleanup of Vista is completed with a product called Windows 7, when some folks still argue their favorite version of Windows ever. That's October of 2009. And then Windows Azure around that, it comes out in February of 2010. 2010 is a big year for Microsoft, good and bad, tough times. The first version of Windows Azure, SQL Azure, support for .NET, PHP, and Java, right from day one, in the web roles and the app roles, right? Very much a serverless model, although it had its problems. And it's also when the iPad is announced. The big iPhone arrives in March of 2010. And within a month, Steve Jobs puts out a letter called Thoughts on Flash, where he talks about the fact that that Flash is bad and that he's not going to let it run on iOS. Now, one of the reasons that Flash was bad is that it was murdering the battery in the iPod. In the iPad. And so by blocking it on Safari, most people would never run it. He was already looking at the HTML5 specifications. We're still in early days, but he could see that we weren't going to need Flash going forward. And it had, Flash had been a bit of a written product in the first place, maybe wouldn't have gone there. But he also went after the security angle that plugins were a malware vector. In general, most people, your average human, had a tough time knowing what plugins are safe and what wasn't. So suppressing plugins was a good idea. But, that's a big old punch in the head for Silverlight at that point. Not that it stops the announcements that are coming out right around the same time, right? Because that's April of 2010 is when we get Visual Studio 2010, which is a huge version of Studio, of .NET. This is .NET 4, so the first big upgrade of the CLR since 2 in 2005. The rewriting of Visual Studio in a lot of respects. They are using WPF for the rendering side of Studio. The introduction of F#, of a functionally oriented language. Don Syme and his team out of Cambridge in the UK have been doing these experiments for years, utilizing that power of the .NET runtime space to just work on the language and get an editor and a debugger and a runtime space all for free, essentially. And we get Silverlight 4. And Silverlight 4 runs out of the browser. It works in Chrome. They stream the 2010 Olympics using it. Also in Studio 2010 is when Microsoft includes jQuery in the box, an open source library included in the box. And again, on the later talk I'm going to do about when open source came to Microsoft, we'll talk more about that. But it was a very pivotal moment for Microsoft all in all. But for us as the .NET developers, things were pretty shiny in the spring of 2010. But by the fall of 2010, things get a little hard. Because in the last PDC that will ever happen is in Redmond, rained the whole time. And there were no Silverlight sessions. And Mary Jo Foley went to Bob Muglio, who at that time was the president of Server and Tools, so ultimately owned .NET and Azure for that matter, and asked about Silverlight. And Bob says, this is the quote, "Our strategy has shifted." Now, nobody had really talked about this. This is at a time when Microsoft was going through a very challenging period. The iPad was perceived as a existential threat to Windows. And so the Windows team was working very hard to respond to the iPad, which sold absolutely like hotcakes. And so the focus was not on things like Silverlight. They had shifted to how are we going to make all this stuff work together well in the new platforms that were coming down the pipeline. And the fact that Silverlight was not going to run on iOS meant it had limitations. And they just hadn't told us. They hadn't really talked about it at all. And so from April of 2010, when Silverlight 4 was the focus of the best way to do enterprise class development, till October of 2010, where our strategy has shifted, there's just been no conversations. And to this day, there are people angry about that, alienated about that. Now, Silverlight doesn't evaporate. It doesn't disappear. In fact, they will ship another version of Silverlight. By December of 2011, they'll have Silverlight 5, which is in support for 10 years. It ends this year in 2021 is when Silverlight actually goes out of support. But it doesn't matter. That moment when Bob says that thing becomes Silverlight is dead, and Microsoft didn't tell us, and people get angry. Also, by 2011, we get the real browser wars. IE9 is out, and Firefox, and Chrome, and HTML5 becomes this rapid-fire iteration as they try and improve performance. This is, in some respects, I think, when JavaScript really grows up. Node had been around for a couple of years, but Node becomes really important at this point, because the idea of JavaScript being a robust language of its own self and able to run outside of the browser, not just glue for browsers, really comes to a forefront. And that's an interesting side note to ultimately this new version of Windows, the iPad competitive version of Windows, Windows 8, and the new conference build. So the first build was in Anaheim, California, and it's where they announced Windows 8, Server 2012, and Studio 2012. This is also where they announced a focus on JavaScript with Winjs and this idea of programming JavaScript top to bottom inside of the Microsoft ecosystem. This is also the point where that consent decree signed in 2001 by Steve Ballmer ends, all at the same time. Now, the focus on Windows in 2011 made a lot of sense. You know, I pulled the Microsoft annual report for 2011, and we talked about the billion-dollar businesses of Microsoft at the time. And here they are. These are all the businesses that brought in more than $1 billion for Microsoft, that as much as that annual report breaks things out. So, I mean, it's literally a dozen different lines of business, and 9 of them are Windows-centric. Whether you, besides Windows itself, also in Office, Exchange, SharePoint, SQL Server, Studio, Dynamics, System Center, all these moneymakers, all Windows-centric. The 3 that are not Windows-centric are Xbox, Bing, and Skype, which may all be billion-dollar businesses, but Xbox is still recovering from the red ring of death. So while they may have made a couple of $1 billion, they spent 4 or 5 trying to clean up the mess. Bing brought in more than $1 billion, to spend twice that trying to function. And Skype, they paid $8 billion for. So the 3 non-Windows businesses, they didn't make money. So it's not all that surprising that they were doubling down on Windows at that time. And it was a pretty brief time for .NET, I think. Carl and I were at that Anaheim build, and we walked out of there, and I said to him, what if .NET doesn't rock? And we started the tablet show after that. That was our backup plan. We also needed a place to put the tablet content. But times are also shifting, because our not quite as young Miguel Diaz at this time, 10 years further on, has a new company formed. The Mono project has been limping along for some time, but doing some great things. He and his friend Nat Friedman formed a new company called Xamarin. And what they've done is they'd implemented C# that ran both on the iPhone and on Android at that point. So as much as Microsoft was focusing on JavaScript for Windows, Xamarin was focusing on C# for everything else. Almost at the same year, it was all happening simultaneously. Microsoft updates their logo for the first time in 25 years in 2012. That's the new style. And the movement towards open source, and I'll talk more about this later today, expands with this MS Opentech. This is also in 2012. A guy named Jean Poli is running it, and they're making sure that .NET works great with open source libraries like Memcached and Elasticsearch and so forth. It's also where they start shipping more stuff of Microsoft's as open source. In fact, this is when they make Entity Framework into an open source library. And I'll tell that story later on today as well. So the beginning with jQuery, it goes further. And we get Studio 2012, which has support for ARM, because they're starting to make the Surface Books. And we get MVC4. You know, there's a lot good happening in dev. Silverlight's kind of out in the cold, but good things are going on. And then we actually get the shipping of Windows 8 in October of 2012, and the first version of Winjs. And of course, this was when there was a huge push for app stores. But when you inventoried the apps, the Windows App Store, almost all of the apps in there were written in C# and XAML. And so, you know, even if the emphasis for the Windows team had been on Winjs, that's not what was being built. And so the tide shifts again. We get a new version of Studio 2013 pretty quickly after that, that focuses on that shift, the shift away from Windows, ultimately. And the big thing you notice at that same time is they rename Azure from Windows Azure to Microsoft Azure. So the fallout from Windows 8 and that all of those pressures ultimately land with Steve Ballmer moving on, Satya Nadella taking over as CEO, the renaming of Azure, and their focus on the cloud as their most important product. And in April of 2014, we get the next build, which is when they announced the .NET Foundation, and Roslyn ships. Now, Roslyn had been running project to write C# in C#. It's sort of a basic metaphor for languages that should always happen. It's just been hugely late, and there's many reasons why that happened. But now it finally is released. But although it hadn't intended to initially, it's also cross-platform and open source, and it ships out on GitHub. And Windows is announced as free for devices under 9-inch screens. Windows, free. You don't recognize that's when Microsoft changed. That's when Microsoft changed. And moving up to 2015, we Studio 2015, kind of a definitive version of Studio. The versions have continued from here, but the foundation of the modern version of Studio is really in 2015, and Visual Studio Code. I haven't mentioned TypeScript at all. The TypeScript shipped in 2014 as well, and it's important in the open source story. I'll tell that later on today. An hour for this history is just barely enough time. In February 2016, they acquire Xamarin. So Miguel Diaz at Friedman, and all those great people come into the company, and they start organizing all that tooling. The press around .NET Core comes in a couple of waves that they now want to rewrite .NET as open source and cross-platform all the way up. It takes some time. They announced it in 2014, but they actually shipped the first version in June of 2016, and then follow rapidly with a 1.1, a 2.0, then a 2.1. The move over to GitHub is huge, and ultimately results by 2018 in October with the acquisition of GitHub. One would say the protection of GitHub. It's very interesting to see the cultural shift there, that Microsoft went from the predator that was taking that product to the company that would protect it. And so even though it was some initial backlash, most people were like, no, GitHub's way better off being owned by Microsoft. At least we can count on it sticking around for sure. And now, getting closer to the present with .NET Core, all the way to this fall, to November of 2020 with .NET Core 5. And the beginning of the unification of the .NET lines. So they built this new version of .NET, open source and cross-platform, while still maintaining the original framework up to 4.8. And now they want to put the two together and stop duplicating effort. There's new features that are appearing on the core versions that aren't going to appear in the traditional framework version. So making it transparent to be unified together. They'd hoped to get there with 5. But they couldn't. It's too much to do. 6 and 7 are already in plans. And so that's the future of .NET, is more versions and more unification. I've worked really hard on gathering the story. I started writing it in 2017 was when I first got the idea. I actually went to the 15th anniversary party of the shipping of .NET, and they gave me the idea. And I've set up a website called History of .NET, and you can register there to be kept abreast of it. I am trying to finish this book. I'm hoping 2021 is the year it'll be done. It's a complicated history intertwined with a tremendous number of my friends, and a joy for smart people who worked really hard to do the right thing over a long time and a lot of shifts. And I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks so much for coming out to Philly.net. I'll happily answer questions for as long as you want to today at the end of the recording.
Yep. Thank you, Richard. This is Tony interrupting for a second. I'm going to stop the recording now.